Uh, Hello and welcome, everyone. We've got a big turnout today for an exciting presentation. My name's David McElnay, and I'm representing the executive committee of the Urban Design Panel today and introducing a fantastic December Urban Design Panel entitled Social Housing Models in Practice, a Vienna Case Study. But before that, just a quick blurb on what we do and what we try to bring to the table every month. The Urban Design Panel is sponsored jointly by the American Institute of Architects, the American Planning Association, and the American Society of Landscape Architects, and is it composed of professionals from those three organizations with a shared interest in urban design. We're joined today by Kathy Wendland of AIA Oregon. AIA Oregon has hosted this event for many years, since COVID. Generously offers this monthly Zoom meeting, which is now until further notice. Our panel presentation can be found on the AIA of Oregon event calendar on their website, as well as the weekly Thursdays at 3 newsletter that comes out. You can contact Kathy to get on that newsletter. So our UDP Urban Design Panel presentations are held every third Tuesday of the month. And to request a registration or suggest a future topic, simply send an email to Kathy Wendland at AIA Oregon. Find that in the chat box. This presentation will be approximately 30 to 40 minutes and be followed by a Q&A session. For the Q&A, please put your questions in the chat box. Also, feel free to raise your hand virtually at the end of the presentation if you like, and we'll call on you for questions. Our executive committee member, Fiona Lyon, will be managing the chat Q&A for this meeting and will pose these questions following the presentation. And also follow-up questions can be sent directly to today's presenters via their email addresses, should they care to place them in the chat box when they get a moment. If you're so interested in following up on any questions. These presentations are recorded, thus it was the prompt in having to say okay in order to start the recording. And that is done simply so that we can archive these panel presentations at a link that will be provided by AIA Oregon, Kathy, once she gets a chance to set that up. And so with that, I'm going to quickly turn it over to Brian and Amanda for Social Housing Models in Practice Vienna Case Study. Brian and Amanda, please take it away.
Thanks, David.
Mhm.
Just do a quick intro. My name's Amanda Ufheil-Somers. I am a project manager at ECOnorthwest. For folks who might not know us, we are a public policy and research firm. I'm actually a planner, and my work focuses on housing and equitable development with a particular interest in alternative ways of owning and stewarding property. So everything from land trust to cooperatives and now social housing. I'll turn over to Brian.
Thanks, David, and thanks, Amanda. Hello, everyone. I'm Brian Squillace. I'm a principal at Bora Architecture Interiors, and I lead our community development work. That's working across a lot of public and nonprofit partners, as well as in the affordable housing space. The social housing effort, to me, to get personal just for one moment, is incredibly meaningful. Just the fact that we're sitting here today and that all of you joined and that we're having this conversation. I started my career in community organizing. That led me to designing co-housing communities across North America for about 7 years. That led into other types of socially oriented and community-centered housing development and design. So for me, this is a really unique moment that we have the political curiosity and hopefully will, and a really diverse local brain trust that are talking seriously about these topics and thinking about more equitable development models. So thank you for coming. This is incredibly exciting for me personally, meaningful. With that, I think we'll jump right into it. So we've broken our presentation down into 3 unevenly sized pieces. First, we're going to spend a little time thinking about and talking about what is social housing. This is a broad term that is used in different ways in different countries. So we're going to kind of share kind of our perspective on what does make something uniquely social housing, with an acknowledgement that this is a wide definition that we're going to wade through together in the city of Portland over the coming months and years, assuming this conversation continues to build momentum and discussion around it. We'll then take a trip to Vienna. Amanda and I both had the opportunity to go with a cohort of 25 or so people across different disciplines in Portland to Vienna in September for a week, early September. So we're going to share a little bit about their model and why specifically we're talking about Vienna in comparison to the many other models that are out there globally and regionally as well. And then finally, we'll close with some reflections on our home state and our city of Portland and how some of this might start to translate and start to roll out here. Social housing isn't a singular system. It describes a variety of models which all kind of hold housing as a public good, which center housing as a human right that is foundational to what social housing is, rather than seeing it as a commodity for profit, right? So it's a real kind of shift from how we think about our housing systems. As a development model, the left-hand column here, it's typically publicly or nonprofit owned. It's typically protected from growth and speculation in the marketplace. It provides long-term affordability and stability to tenants, often by basing rents on the cost of operations, maintenance, development, right? So take profit out of that equation largely. The tools here aren't all that foreign from a lot of what we use, but to succeed, the social housing itself becomes a system, right? It is the overlap of development and policy and social services, financing structures. It's much more than just a new typology of building or planning that we're really talking about. And this system really relies on scale if we want to have impact with it. And so it's taking a lot of those tools, land banking, mixed income developments, cooperatives, affordable home ownership, things we talk about in similar circles all the time. And it's putting those into practice at a scale that has really been unprecedented locally and thinking about how we streamline those efforts and what the right mix of these tools is. As an architectural model, the right-hand column here, there's a strong focus on social cohesion, social infrastructure, I guess planning and architectural model, I should say. It focuses on walkable, transit-oriented development, right? Things that we know and we know how to do already. It integrates housing with open space. It plans for those soft edges so that we can have really great transitional spaces between private and the public, or the public and the commons, and how do we kind of use small design moves to help density feel comfortable, feel welcoming, feel inclusive, right? So not really foreign things. It's just putting them together with an intention and shifting kind of the way that we think about housing as commodity towards housing as human right. All right, we tested this earlier. I hope it works. Sit tight. I'm gonna hit play on this video. Take a couple bites of your lunch. This is about 3 minutes long. It's gonna offer up a description of how social housing, in a particular cost-based rent model, is working in Vancouver, British Columbia. This is very similar to the strategy that's used in Vienna and other places. It's a better description that I found specifically to Vienna. So I think it's worth spending a couple moments here. So I'll mute myself and let's see if we can get this to work.
Olympic Village is your classic Vancouver neighborhood. Seawall? Check. Outdoor athletic store? Check. Big boxy glass buildings? Check. And crazy expensive housing? Oh, you better believe that's a big check. Renting an Olympic Village is not cheap. For example, a 2-bedroom apartment in that building behind me will cost you $4,200 a month. A 2-bedroom in this building, $5,000 a month. A 2-bedroom unit in this building rents for $4,500 a month. And just across the street, a 2-bedroom unit in that building rents for $1,900. How's that possible? Who's behind this? And could that be the subject of this video? So how is this building so affordable? Well, it's really quite simple. It doesn't make money. Let me elaborate. This building is owned by the Athletes Village Housing Co-op, a non-profit cooperative. Like the name suggests, the co-op isn't trying to make a profit from this building, so it sets rents that only cover the building's operating costs. Things like heat, water, electricity, taxes, mortgage payments, and maintenance. The building next door is a condo, and that 2-bedroom unit is owned by an individual or corporation who very much wants to make some money from their housing, so they can rent it out for, well, really whatever price they can get. Any money they make on top of their own operating costs is profit they can pocket for themselves. Sorry, I just explained to you how landlords work. The condo is an example of market housing. The price is set by the highest bidder. The Athletes Village Co-op is an example of non-market housing. The rent is set by just how much it costs to provide the housing. Why does housing like this exist? Well, it's because many people and organizations recognize that housing is, a need, and so they choose to provide housing without trying to make a profit. In some cases, there are charities such as churches and YMCAs who decide to build housing as part of their larger mission. There are nonprofit organizations specifically for housing who often own multiple properties and rent them out like a regular landlord. There are nonprofit co-ops where a group of people collectively own and manage a building and rent it to themselves. Then there's housing that's provided by the government through agencies like BC Housing. And within these categories, there are all kinds of specializations, such as housing for seniors, single moms, refugees, and even Korean seniors. Well, I guess I know my retirement plans. Now, is it always affordable housing? Well, that part's a bit more complicated. Cutting out profits can certainly make rents a bit cheaper, but at the end of the day, it still costs a lot of money to build and operate any building. Some non-market housing does receive subsidies to make its rents really affordable, but without those subsidies, non-market housing rents start out pretty comparable to market rents. Take, for example, Hannelore Housing. It's a new non-market housing development by the Oak Ridge Lutheran Church. It didn't receive major subsidies, so it charges $2,400 for a 2-bedroom, which is, not exactly cheap. But what can make Hannelore Housing more affordable is time. Hannelore Housing is in an up-and-coming neighborhood called Oak Ridge. In a decade or so, this will likely be a major city center, where art transcends museums, music travels freely, style comes naturally, beauty is all around, and dance is part of life. Wow. Anyways, a regular landlord here would be foolish not to hike up their rents, but Hannelore Housing would keep their rents more or less the same, and over time, that would make its rents relatively affordable. That's why the Athletes Village Co-op seems so affordable now. $1,900 for a 2-bedroom was actually pretty typical for Olympic Village back when it was built in 2010. But today, the co-op is still charging more or less the same amount, while its neighbors have hiked up rents year after year. But there's one more thing that happens with even more time. You see, Athletes Village Co-op and Hannelore Housing took out bank loans to construct their buildings, so much of the rent you pay here goes towards paying off those loans. So what happens when they finish paying their loans? Well, the housing becomes cheap, like really cheap. That's been the case for this co-op from the 1980s, where rents for a 2-bedroom are only $1,000 a month, and the reason why is because it's fully paid off its loans. And that is why many believe non-market housing could be an answer to the housing
crisis. So Amanda will get into more of the nuts and bolts shortly in Vienna's model in particular, but they leverage a very similar cost-based model for a lot of their housing there. And it's something that I think we'll certainly be talking about more here as well. So let's take a trip to Vienna, the world's most livable city. Not necessarily most liked, most beautiful. It's probably up there for those two, but most livable because of the attainable quality of life, the access to transit, stable housing, and general happiness. Their social housing system started a little over 100 years ago. They refer to it as the Red Vienna period. Shortly after World War I, they started investing in municipally owned housing. Social housing exists in many other parts of the world, but this is the most mature and widespread system. This is why we look at Vienna. There's deeper study to be done, looking at the nuance of systems in Singapore, Spain, Argentina, New Zealand, many others, but none of those are nearly as robust, nor do they have the longevity that Vienna has had. We also have North American peers. There's similar efforts happening and social housing programs that have started in Seattle, Vancouver, BC, of course, Chicago, Los Angeles, Montgomery County, Maryland. These are great peers, but they're just getting started. So, they're worthy of our study. They're worthy of our setting up work groups with as we think about what this means for Oregon. The only ones of those that I'm aware of that have actually built or acquired buildings are Vancouver, BC, and Montgomery County, Maryland. Each have a couple buildings at most, right? So really not comparable to Vienna. As we're starting to immerse ourselves in what this might mean, there's a solid reason why Vienna is the starting point for these conversations. Austria starts by acknowledging housing is a human right. You've heard me say that already. And that societally, it needs to be broadly distributed. So each of the green dots on this map here is one of the social housing buildings or communities in Vienna proper. You can see they're distributed across the entirety of the city, every district. Over time, Vienna has acquired and rehabbed buildings. They've done singular redevelopments. They've built massive master planned communities and neighborhoods. They've worked at many different scales with many different communities, immigrants, family-centered units, single-parent-centered units, designing for seniors. They've really stretched their model in many directions over the last 100 years. And so there's a lot that we can really dig into and a lot that we can learn from there. This is the neighborhood that Amanda and I visited when we went. The whole cohort stayed in this neighborhood, and this is what it looked like 10 years ago. Today, the aerial looks like this. So they're building not only at scale, but they're doing it rapidly. Sonnenviertel has, I think it was close to 10,000 residents. Amanda, maybe you can correct me if you remember otherwise on that. It's high density, 5 to 12 stories for most of the development. It is mixed income throughout. There are different types of social housing models that Amanda will get to that touch on different price points. They put in their transit first, they put in their open space first, so that when you come to this neighborhood, there's a sense of place there already. There are amenities coordinated across the different development sites so that you have the breadth of what's needed to really establish a walkable and inclusive lifestyle. This is what it looks like from on the ground. This is that linear park running through the entirety of the transit, coming right up the middle. Balconies everywhere, activating and engaging those larger public spaces, footpaths crisscrossing, connecting transit, grocers, elementary school, childcare, you name it. It's really a reinvention of density, and with a wonderful sense of looseness about it, honestly, in those open spaces, and active at all hours. So with that, Amanda, I think I hand it to you. Take us to the nuts and bolts.
Thanks, Brian. So when we talk about social housing, it's a really diverse spectrum of different sort of forms, building forms, sort of housing typologies and ownership. This sort of represents that spectrum, everything from the left side, which is what most people think of with social housing, municipal housing. So these are buildings that are owned and operated directly by the city. That next square is limited profit housing. So this is the other sort of major sector that's private market, construction, ownership, operation, but regulated as a social housing product. This also includes owner cooperatives, whether they're rental or ownership. It includes gentle density, which is the way the city is helping to subsidize adding additional floors to older built up parts of the city to increase density and improve energy efficiency. And it also includes city funding for temporary emergency housing. And then this sort of middle one, smart apartments, just wanted to highlight, these are not necessarily a different type, but this is an approach to including smaller apartments of all sizes, from 1 bedrooms to 5 bedrooms in social housing, so that there's a real variety and diversity of price points for households with different incomes within a building. So how does social housing play into the sort of broader housing market in Vienna? You can see here that it's a very significant part of the housing stock. So these first two, this is a borrowed graphic. So council housing, that's municipal housing, over 20%. There's another over 20%, that's that limited profit sector. And so together, more than 40% is that sort of big, sort of obviously social housing sector, and that houses about half, maybe a little over half of Vienna's population. There's also another almost quarter of the housing stock that is privately rented, but is very strictly rent controlled. So those are buildings that are from before World War II. And then a smaller share that's private rental and not price regulated. And then you can see a pretty small share, only about 20%, that is owned. So more than 3/4 of Viennese are renters. This is in contrast to Austria as a whole, which is a predominantly owner society. So Vienna is also sort of a particular urban renter environment, even compared to the country as a whole. On the tenant side, some key features are that in addition to it being a sort of very available and wide option, it's also easy to access. So the only requirements to accessing the social housing system is that you have lived in Vienna for 2 years and that you earn less than 150% of the median income. Tenancies are permanent. They're open-ended leases. They are inheritable by family members. And there's really strong tenant protection laws at the federal level. So there's very limited circumstances for eviction. People have a lot of stability in their homes in the social housing system. But there's also enough mobility within the system that it's possible to change apartments when your household circumstances change. So people are moving as their households grow or shrink. It's not that people don't necessarily get trapped. They just choose to sort of make community in their buildings for a very long time. There's a point system that sort of helps prioritize high need households, whether entering the system or moving within it. So there are additional supports and points for people at risk of homelessness, people escaping domestic violence, single parents, elders, and people with disabilities, among many other categories. And depending on the type of social housing and how old the building is, the size of the apartment, rents are 25 to 40% lower compared to the private market. And various entities in Austria have studied the effect of this system on rents, on private market rents in Vienna, and have demonstrated a sort of moderating or dampening effect on private market rents. So there is a really large system of public and private sector actors that make the social housing sector function. And here we're just highlighting some of the key players. First on the left is the city of Vienna, obviously very important. And these are just 4 of some of the departments within the city that regulate and operate the social housing system. They have a public property manager. There are resident services that are provided through the city. There's even tenant legal services for both residents of social housing as well as just any renter in the city. And there's also a land bank and urban renewal authority that's a sort of semi-public company that is run by the city. The second really key player here is that middle GBV. That is the acronym for the Federation of Limited Profit Housing Associations. So those are the limited profit private development actors that are building sort of and operate half of the social housing system. And there's a sort of huge array of other actors, private sector, charities, but I just wanted to highlight here a few key ones, that there are private lenders who are funding the development of social housing. The European Central Bank is a very important source of subsidized dollars that sort of flow through those private banks in order to fund social housing specifically. And the Labor Council is another important actor that does research and also is an advocate on behalf of tenants of social housing. And since the 1960s, I just want to highlight that the limited profit housing associations have actually been building the majority of social housing, while the public sector has effectively really stopped building after the 1990s, partly due to costs. So we heard on our trip that the city is just starting to step into that direct construction space again and have about 4 projects in progress or near completion. So next slide, we'll just dig into a little bit more of that limited profit sector. This is similar to our sort of CDC or nonprofit developer world. But an important difference is that this sector is governed by federal law, and that law determines the kind of business activities they're allowed to engage in. It sets executive compensation. It defines what limited profit means and sort of regulates how that profit can be used. There are almost 200 of these independent companies in Austria. They range in size, but the average association owns and operates about 5,000 units, everything from rental units to owned units. And these are also very different companies from one another. Some of them are owned by public and private sector actors. Some are cooperatives. So there's a huge range of different kinds of development actors, but they're all sort of under this umbrella of limited profit. And altogether, every year, that sector contributes about $4 billion to the economy in terms of construction and renovation activities. So on the public sector side, one actor to highlight here is the Land Bank and the Urban Renewal Authority. They play a really big role in sort of setting the agenda for social housing development, particularly through master planning. So interestingly, even though this system has existed for about a century, the Land Bank was only established in the 80s, and they now own about 740 acres of buildable land, 3/4 of which has to be used for social housing. And they sell land through developer competitions for master planned areas, which Brian's going to share more about in a moment. They also are the entity that subsidizes neighborhood level and building level renovations of older housing stock, both social and private, to improve energy efficiency and add that density I was talking about earlier. They even have an office that provides free advising to just individual home and building owners about the renovation process. So they are really active at sort of all scales across the city in terms of supporting a really robust and diverse housing system. So next slide gets into a little bit of more and more nuts and bolts. How does this work from a financing perspective? This is a typical limited profit project, which for folks that are familiar with development looks a lot more like a market capital stack, a market rate capital stack in the United States. You've got a bank loan, you've got a city loan, which is subordinate to the bank loan. And you can see here that all of the capital involved in this development is relatively low interest, both from the private banks and then ultra low interest from the city. The developers also put in their own equity, about 1/4 for every project. And another component of limited profit housing that's really different than our system is the slice of that other slice, that 7% of tenant equity. So this is effectively a down payment from future tenants that goes into the project. And something that is a sort of culture and mind shift, I think from the US perspective, is that equity contribution actually does not appreciate in value. It depreciates at 1% a year, and tenants receive the current value when or if they decide to move out. But that's really a contribution to making sure this building can happen and be stewarded and available for future generations. And I'll also note that we heard, one more thing on that slide, sorry, Brian, is that the city does provide ultra low cost or zero interest loans for that tenant contribution for low income households that are lined up to occupy that building. So that is not a barrier to entry for folks that are at the lower end of the income spectrum or might also be receiving rental subsidies in order to live there. So this is looking at what that looks like from the revenue side. So this is an example. All of the housing in Vienna uses a cost-based rental model that's governed by law. So this graphic here represents sort of the left bar is, let's say, a year one breakdown of the rent structure. The one on the right is, let's say, year 35. So while the debt is still being repaid, the components of that rent include that bottom bar, in blue is the profit that can be made on the equity investment from the developer. Green represents operating expenses and maintenance. And then the bulk of that rent during loan repayment is really addressing paying off debt. We heard that typically that works to pay off the bank loan first, and then the city loan is repaid in the last couple of years, which is easier to do because it's a super low interest. And then after debt is repaid, you can see that that profit on the equity investment stays the same. The share of rent that's going towards operating expenses and saving for replacement reserves and just long-term plans for renovation and upkeep of the building and upgrading systems is bigger. And then the rest of that rent is the sort of base cost-based rent that's set by law. So that's a per square foot limit that adjusts slightly for inflation every year or two. And the equity gains, that sort of profit on the equity investment, you can see goes up into a revolving loan fund. And that's the source that limited profit developers use to sort of fund future development. And that is actually a key component of the law that governs that sector. They are required to invest that profit gain into new housing construction. So regardless of sort of market conditions, there's always construction happening for housing in Vienna. Another note here that I thought was really interesting is that limited profit law also requires that each building be sustainable on its own. So portfolio cross subsidy is not allowed, which is another incentive to create really diverse buildings with different apartment types and different incomes to sort of support the sustainability on an individual building level. And I think I am now handing it back to Brian to talk more pretty and fun things.
You can tell our brains work a little bit differently. Amanda's got the nuts and bolts dialed. So any questions that relate to numbers are going straight to Amanda, but pretty pictures are mine. I want to talk a little bit about the incredible level of coordination that goes into this system. Again, it both feels familiar and attainable, and yet somehow revolutionary in the way that it all kind of clicks in Vienna, right? And that's because they've had 100 years of refining this system and really kind of working through these things together. The basis for their evaluation of both planning work and individual development sites is this 4-pillar model. The wording here is a little small, but they lean into the economics of each project clearly, the architectural or planning design quality, ecology and environment. And then the fourth lever that I don't think we lean into as often here is that around social infrastructure, social responsibility and cohesion, and how are these developments going to collectively build those inclusive lifestyles and opportunities. When they're master planning for a new social housing neighborhood, they start with the transit. And they start with the open space. They build each of these out so that the transit stop actually starts to name the neighborhood. It raises awareness long before individual development sites or housing is created. But you start to understand where this place lives within the city and how I'm going to get there. And you can start to kind of lay that vision out collectively. This neighborhood, Schießstadt Aspern, has been built out over the last 15 years. It's currently housing about 10,000 people, and it will be growing to house about 25,000 more people. I believe it's in the next 10, 15 years that they're planning to complete it. They learn lessons from one development phase to the next to improve things like their traffic calming strategies and how to better assure lease up and stability for commercial spaces, especially when you haven't yet welcomed enough residents into that neighborhood to support those commercial spaces, right? So there's a lot of coordination between sites and mix of uses to figure out how those things are going to sync up. At a master plan level, they preference shared parking. They keep that parking to the edge of the neighborhood. They encourage walkability. This both makes the build out of each site more efficient, makes the parking layouts more efficient, while incentivizing that walking. In this neighborhood in particular, we heard that each tenant moving in was actually given a small shopping trolley, a small grocery cart, right? So they could get from their unit to that grocer more conveniently than they can get to their car. So it's a lot of those little details and coordination between them to figure out how it comes together. Across the development sites, they also coordinate the amenity spaces and what those kind of retail and commercial opportunities are going to be, so that not every developer includes the cafe, right? They want the right mix of uses to help activate the whole neighborhood. Some of these are commercial spaces. There are cafes, grocers, there's education, childcare, elementary schools going into each of these larger neighborhoods. And some of these are non-commercial third spaces, right? Co-working opportunities, music and craft rooms, wood shops that are really distributed across different buildings across the neighborhood. And it's not just the residents that typically has access to those spaces, but some of it is shared by folks that don't necessarily live in each of those buildings. And within all this, they're really paying attention to those small details, right? How do we make density livable? How do we activate larger public spaces? How do we scale spaces down? How do we line larger spaces with balconies to encourage passive supervision and improve safety? We put kitchens facing playgrounds so that, well, dad or mom is doing dishes, they can, see through their window to understand where the kids are at and what's going on with them. It's all of these little things, right, that really create this intergenerational community that clicks in the end. They're prioritizing that pedestrian experience for everybody, right? This is, there is delivery vehicular access down this this pedestrian street that we're looking at right here. The commercial spaces all front onto this pedestrian street, right? So again, you don't get in your car to go see them. The parking is pushed to the side. You walk down to the grocery, you walk down the mail boxes, the package lockers for each of these developments is facing onto this pedestrian road, right? So it's all these little ways of generating people hours and building activity to assure that you really have active spaces in the end. Couple just one-off pictures here that we took. On the left is an image of a senior living community. This is a graded and continuing care community that goes right on through dementia care and has no parking adjacent to it. The nearest street is a block away. It's adjacent to the playground, right? So that there is this intergenerational mix the entire time happening. As I was sitting out here in the morning watching seniors come in and out of the building, families visit, kids on their way to school, biking through. Pretty amazing and different from what we might consider accessible, right? On the right is that an elevated view of that same pedestrian way that I had just shown on the last slide, with a delivery truck coming through early in the morning one day. On the left here was some traffic calming that was put in place after development of a street. And in the next phase of development, they realized traffic was moving too fast. So they staggered some trees through there to slow that traffic down. On the right, those bright yellow bridges connect the amenity spaces of different developments by different developers and different architects. And that was coordinated at the planning level as a requirement from the city that these spaces will be available to others coming in, right? So really deep coordination from development to development. And not all of it has to be giant yellow bridges, right? A lot of these are small moments of wonder or small moments of coziness that really kind of draw people in and just give an air of livability that's really undeniable in a lot of these spaces. And with that, Vienna is not without its challenges. Back to you, Amanda.
Yeah, lest it seem like it's all shiny and golden, we did hear about some of the challenges that they're experiencing, and from this list you can see that they're not that different from what we experience here in our housing development production environment. They're also encountering rising land prices and construction costs. Rising interest rates have been an issue the past few years. On the development side, we really did hear that the city's ambitious climate goals, while important and valuable, really do have an effect on development feasibility with different designs, materials, the requirements for energy efficient renovations. Like that has an impact, and it's something that developers in the city are trying to work through to address. More on the tenant side, we hear that even though social housing is such a big part of the available housing stock and is broadly available and has a dampening effect on rents, there's still an issue with folks that do not have access to that system or do not yet have access to that system, experiencing really volatile price spikes in the private market. And then we also heard about the while this is a very established system, it functions very well. There's a lot of commitment to it at the local level, both on the public side and the private side. Vienna also exists in a broader, more conservative national environment. And so folks are very aware that this system, with sort of some light changes in sort of the legal infrastructure and political leadership, both locally and nationally, like this could change. This is not guaranteed. So that's the sort of dynamic between local and national context is also at play in Vienna, and something that we heard a lot about, and there's a lot of sort of apprehension about and care to continue have partners work together to sort of navigate that and protect the system.
Yeah, wrapping up here, or getting close to wrapping up, I just want to one more time mention these tools aren't foreign, right? I think that there are places for the tools that we're already using within this framework and in this discussion. There are places for all of the players that we already have within this discussion. There's a lot of overlap between limited profit model and our CDCs, right? There's a lot of discussion to be had about how does a social housing model here open up new opportunities for stability and capacity building that a lot of our partners and organizations have struggled with over the years with the capital A affordable housing system that we have, right? So I don't think this is an exclusive conversation. I think this is why this brain trust right here today is so important, is we start to get to dream about how these things fold into the systems that we have. There's a lot of overlap in the little band-aids that we've been putting on a system that has a lot of people falling through the cracks, right? Community land trusts and mixed income developments, co-ops and co-housing communities. You can read along here with me. Well, Vienna's model is largely focused on rental units. This isn't to say that we need to entirely move away from home ownership, right? I think affordable home ownership still plays a significant role in these discussions. And yet, as we talk about the decommodification of housing, it's important to remember that for homeownership to work as a tool for building wealth, there has to be scarcity, right? We cannot solve this problem by introducing an infinite amount of affordable homeownership or an infinite amount of any one of these strategies. We really need to kind of open up the way we think differently to still provide equitable opportunities into the current models we have, but also start to shift our broader lens about what makes really great communities and how might we grow wealth outside of the housing market, and show more pathways there. If we can assure stability in housing, people would then have, and affordability, people would then have more income to invest in other places and other areas, right? So I think there's a lot of shift that can happen in how we consider these things. Please note our trip to Vienna that Amanda and I took was not orchestrated by the city. It was a group of folks that got together with the support and organization of some MERP students at PSU, and we were able to leverage a local brain trust that is then informing the study that the Portland Housing Bureau is currently putting together for City Council. They will be submitting their implementation strategies in the spring of this coming year. So there's a rather short timeline to then kind of kick off much broader conversations with other experts and professionals on kind of how we might actually start to roll a similar system out or design kind of a social housing system here. There is also ongoing research being conducted into the similar models across the US and those internationally, right? We're not solely focused on Vienna. There are good reasons to start where we've started, but we certainly want to harvest from all of the ideas that we can learn about at the same time. That concludes our presentation. So Fiona, I think I pass it over to you there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. Brian, that was really rich in content and just expansive thinking and really great ideas. Thank you for kind of giving us that overview. So we got a couple questions coming in. I'm just gonna pepper them at you. I think I'm gonna start with David's. Hello, David. It says, during your trip, did you gain any particular insight into how conditions are created for the land banking and land trusts to be supported? And I think just maybe building on that a little bit, you showed that great aerial image from 10 years ago of the site that you kind of focused on during your visit. Just like what kind of land was that before it became social housing? If you could just kind of talk about, are they going in and doing site acquisition and kind of changing land use, or are these undeveloped kind of reserves, land reserves around the region. Just, yeah, if you could kind of dig into that question a bit, that would be great.
Should I start there, Brian?
Sure, go for it.
Yeah, so the land bank focuses on acquiring agricultural land that is then sort of the zoning designation that sort of supports the conversion of open space into housing. Is it basically requires that when it becomes developed, that 75% of it has to go to social housing. So that is a tool that helps sort of maintain more affordable land prices for the land bank to acquire. Another interesting point there is that the land bank is not allowed to make a profit on land sales. So there's also a sort of cap on what they're allowed to sell land for those master plan developments. So most of the land that they are acquiring is that sort of currently agricultural, but in transition as, sort of farming families sort of generational shift and sort of what children want to do with that land and don't want to continue being farmers, and as just land uses around the city change. The site that we were on, Sonnenviertal, was actually owned, that was a train yard. It was owned by the National Rail Company. And so that project was actually done in partnership with the land bank. The land bank sort of acted as a development, like an urban renewal authority on behalf of the rail company. And so really strong partnership, since the rail company is not used to doing that kind of level of development. So that was also exciting to hear about the ways that the land bank is such an important partner and resource to other major landowners, even if they don't control land themselves.
And that was the housing authority that was, or the kind of urban renewal group that was also in charge of that land banking
Yes. Yeah.
transactions. Okay, cool. Kind of a related question. David has one just about social housing. Property taxes, is that collected on those parcels?
I do believe that there is not a special tax exemption. And another feature of taxes in Europe is that rents are taxed, actually. They have a value add tax on them. So a lot of the subsidy here is really coming from low interest loans, development loans from the city, relatively low land prices for some of those new development areas, and not necessarily happening on the tax side.
Fascinating. Okay, let's see. I'm gonna pop over to Tyler's question. Tyler's wondering if you could talk a little bit more about previous uses and site conditions of these during the planning phase. What kind of land assembly was required? Maybe just kind of going back to that assembly portion. Are there harbor or industrial transition plans given the scale? And is there a proxy for a master plan area in Portland that comes to mind? And maybe kind of just adding to that, just kind of thinking about all the infrastructure, kind of horizontal infrastructure, like how does that get kind of planned in sequence for kind of teeing up these areas for investment in housing?
Yeah, so quite a few of the larger neighborhood sites are industrial redevelopment sites, right? There was an old, in addition to the neighborhood we visited, which was a rail yard, there was an old airport that was transitioned. There was an old harbor site that was transitioned as well. And when those sites are master planned, the city does put all of the horizontal infrastructure in as well as the transit, right? So that really is step one. So they have development ready sites that they're then offering up through competitive RFPs. And so that all comes together with a really significant level of coordination. And they're not selecting site by site, right? They're doing development team selections for multiple sites at a time, so they can then coordinate additional social infrastructure, amenities, things like that across those development teams.
Awesome. Let's see, I'm gonna pop down to Megan's question. Megan asks, what are some of the methods being discussed locally to fund subsidies or other financial support from the city or state governments that you're aware of? Does it involve new or additional tax bills like in Washington, or involve review of existing government resources, budgeting, etc.? Curious what the discussions are like in terms of what is available or being planned. if you're aware. And this may kind of feather into the study that's kind of upcoming.
It really
Portland
does.
Housing
And,
Bureau.
and that's really the answer on that one. There are ideas being volleyed around. There's an acknowledgement that there's not a lot of appetite locally for additional taxes. And so there are various thoughts in play as to where initial funding might come from, how that builds over time, how does it tie into new TIF districts and other funding streams that have already been kind of considered and are on the books as we move forward. So I think, a lot of those specific strategies will be in the Housing Bureau's report that's being delivered to City Council this April, May, as far as how that would actually be implemented.
Right. And I think I'm gonna plug a question that I have because it kind of relates to this. But just so Portland Housing Bureau is doing this study. I guess I'm curious kind of what the broader regional or kind of Northwest sentiment is on something like this, and maybe a parallel. You talked a lot about Vienna, but you also mentioned Austria is a little bit more conservative. Like, was this kind of, what is the scale of impact that you think is kind of an important target to think about? Could this extend beyond Portland to more of a regional model, and how would that work? And just, are there other kind of seeds of interest that you're aware of kind of throughout the Northwest to really engage in a social housing model?
Yeah, I mean, the local conversations are already being had and started with folks in Vancouver and folks in Seattle to kind of learn from what's starting to happen there, together to start to tie together broader strategies. There are partnerships happening between Vienna and Vancouver right now. There's a Vienna house being built in Vancouver and a Vancouver house being built in Vienna, where they're helping each other to understand aspects of their development model, aspects of mass timber, right? There's kind of an active knowledge sharing that's happening, which to me is incredibly exciting. These conversations are starting to happen and roll out with OHCS and at the state level locally. I think it's important we engage Metro as well, of course, to start to think about how does this scale. If we want to see impact, the system relies on scale, right? We're not just housing those of greatest need, which is the approach that we've taken. Not to say we're not doing that as well, but we're rolling out a broader system that assures stability. And to Amanda's point earlier, to see pressure then be put back onto the private market, you have to hit certain levels of scale with this, right? So I think there's an initial rollout of pilot projects just to start to generate understanding, both amongst the lay people of Portland, but also those that are really crunching the numbers on their pro formas, so that we can kind of build that community of support around it from different directions. But then there's a leap to scale really required.
I'll just add there that, just echoing Brian, that there's like so much momentum and activity around a lot of these like components of a social housing system. We have a land trust, we have folks developing new cooperatives in Oregon, we have a rich sort of land trust and cooperative tradition in neighboring Washington as well. So I do think there's momentum in that ecosystem and on a regional level. And one important thing that's very different that we will have to grapple with is that, something like the limited, while Oregon and the Northwest, I think, have a very rich sort of CDC nonprofit developer ecosystem, the limited profit sector in Austria is not transnational. They are a sector that can only operate in Austria, and Vienna is the biggest game in town in terms of a market for housing development. And so that's just a really different environment in terms of being able to sort of gather and concentrate developer interest and within a sort of limited profit structure. So, those are conversations we're going to have to continue to have and figure out how to sort of channel and concentrate that energy in the places where we need it without that sort of limitation at a federal level.
Yeah, makes sense. All right, Brian asks, I understand that the land bank is limited on making profit on land sales. Are 100% of acquisitions and carrying costs covered? Or is there a subsidy to facilitate carrying costs and keeping resale prices low? We kind of talk through that.
That is a good question that I don't know the answer to.
No,
Off the top of my head, but happy to dig into that. I know that given the sort of cap that the land bank is also very interested in like needing to acquire land that is less expensive. And so that zoning tool really helps them, but they are not necessarily selling land at a loss either. So they're working within a constrained environment.
Makes sense. Okay, let's see. Carrie says, did you have the opportunity to visit or study examples that transitioned existing buildings into social housing? I know you talked about, I forget the word you used, the kind of upzone, happy upzone or pretty upzone or examples. What was it called?
Gentle density.
Gentle density. I love that. And just any other examples that don't require, you know, kind of the land banking swap approach, just like kind of the urban infill and going up.
I can jump in. Yes, we did. We saw, you know, we walked past quite a few of their urban renewal projects. Within those, they're typically focused on adding a story to the top, as well as some combination of deep energy retrofits to the buildings. Those are kind of the two main priorities in a lot of those acquisitions and rehabs. We also toured buildings that were built out as social housing largely, but had floors that were then specific to bringing in what they refer to as Baugruppen, which are really co-housing communities, right? And kind of intentionally weaving in different types of intentional living into the neighborhood. So it's not that every development was just the same top to bottom. We saw kind of change of occupancy happening, change of communities happening, infill sites happening, acquisition sites. And I think locally, especially as we start to think about initial precedents and how we kind of test some waters early, I think acquisitions are a really great strategy to be talking about and thinking about, not just new build and not necessarily at the master plan scale to start with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that chart that you showed. Just kind of, there's so many different colors of what this can look like in a community. Let's see. Karine says, I've heard a lot of interest also about the regional land bank strategy. Any thoughts about that? Sounds like that would support social housing as well as just other general housing development approaches. And I think you both have been following Metro's housing strategy. I believe that also just got published, and that includes just a deeper dive into what a regional land bank would look like. Do you have any further thoughts on that?
For me, the short answer is yes.
Let's do it.
I mean, I think that's exactly what we need, right? We need more than just proud ground, you know, and our other kind of smaller land banks that are looking at this, but we need broader regional strategies, and we need governmental support if we're really going to scale land banking.
And I overlooked this before, but it looks like William dropped a link for a good study on land readjustments in the chat if anyone wants to follow up on that. Let's see. I think we're getting close to the end of our questions, and I know we're close to time. Maybe if anyone has one more hot question. Oh, there goes David. It says, is it fair to say that master planning of social housing sites is beneficial to urban design overall? That's a great question to end on. That photo of the kind of community library was so beautiful. Like, how does stuff like that get integrated?
Yeah, I mean, you have to see these places. You have to walk through these places, right? For better or worse, I mean, I'm glad we're able to do a little bit of translation here. But it's the kind of space that you have to feel, that you have to walk through. It's you know, the excitement that we had when the Pearl District was first built out, right? Like this type of aggressive urbanism is not foreign to the space that we're sitting in. And to me, that's part of why it's so exciting. And I think Portland is so uniquely situated to really be a leader in this. But you have to walk through these spaces, and there's no way in my mind that you can create spectacular urban spaces without thinking about that layer of social infrastructure and social cohesion. I think our best spaces do that, and that is in their DNA, top to bottom. It's very clear that that is a priority.
Awesome. All right, well, we're just about at the hour. I want to get everyone out on time. Really huge thanks, Brian, for not just sharing kind of your trip findings and these beautiful inspirational photos, but just all of your knowledge that you bring to this subject. Hopefully the urban design panel can loop back on this topic, mid-year, see what the study from PHB has found and just keep this conversation going. I believe we're still working on our January urban design panel topic, so stay tuned for that soon, and wishing everyone a happy new year and happy holidays, and appreciate you joining today.
All right. Thank you
you so
everybody very
much.
much. Thanks you all.
Thank you.